today's episode, we're going to be covering the Filipino sword design of Doug Marcaida. As many of you know, Doug Marcaida is a judge on History Channel's Forge and Fire, and he also happens to be a Filipino Kali instructor and combatives expert. But he's also a designer. And what I have here, through the graciousness of the owner of this sword, Dwayne Rowe. Dwayne, thank you very much. This really means a lot to me and my subscribers. Also to Ricardo Vilar, who forged the sword design that Kuya Doug Marcaida came up with. And again, I want to explain this. I call him Kuya. Kuya is a term of respect in Tagalog, which means older brother. And it's a term of respect and endearment. What I have here is the Doug Marcaida Itak. Now this Itak, this is the first time I have ever held, let alone witnessed, a Filipino sword that has been executed to this level of craftsmanship and artistry. And it actually makes me feel very proud because Filipino swords generally, they don't get the kind of attention that they ought to get because, quite frankly, Filipino swords, although they have a very storied in their use in Filipino warfare, I think that they haven't gotten as much attention only because they've been relegated to farm tools, the same way the sickle or the kama, the garab, or even the karambit have been relegated to part weaponry, part farm tool, but not a dedicated weapon. So seeing a Filipino Itak get the kind of treatment and craftsmanship from Ricardo Vilar through the collaboration with Doug Marcaida is really astounding. I remember growing up in the 80s and even finding a Filipino sword stateside was almost impossible, let alone of high quality. Of course, there were attempts at it in the past several decades, but to be holding a sword like this in the Itak design, the Itak profile, it really makes me feel very good to see just how much the Filipino martial arts and Filipino blade design, how far it has come in terms of their integration, but also acceptance in terms of their effectiveness. Before I start in my review and analysis, number one, Doug Marcaida actually has a trainer for the sword, and if I'm not mistaken, the sword design itself started as a trainer. So I got to handle this at the Blade Show when I was talking swords and knives with Tomas, and what they have there is a paracord handle here. There isn't one on here now, but this is a really well designed trainer. And what happened is that at some point, Kuya Doug Marcaida went to Ricardo and say, hey, can you make me like a live version of this? I am of the mind that Ricardo is one of those high level knife makers and sword makers that I believe that his art has reached a certain level, like a certain peak we've seen very rarely in the knife world. And I think that considering his relative youth, I think he's just going to keep getting better. Just a little background on Ricardo. He is a protege. He studied directly under Jerry Fisk. And Jerry Fisk has a very special place in my heart. When I first purchased the Camillus OVB buoys that he did as a collaboration with Camillus, I purchased them. I purchased the complete set. I did an episode on them a few months back, and I really enjoy them. They are one of my prized possessions. And I keep them in the box. I keep them absolutely pristine. And Jerry has always been very communicative. I remember when I first spoke to him back in the early 2000s, we had a good communication relating to what the knives were designed for, how they can be taken care of, and their intended use. But there's another reason why Jerry Fisk, in terms of my own development, has a lot of meaning for me, because in Bill Bagwell's big book of battle blades, if somehow you cannot get a Bagwell buoy, who should I speak to? Well, he listed a few names, but one name stood out. He said that knife maker is Jerry Fisk. So I always sought him out. For him to now take under his wing Ricardo Vilar and to have him make this sword for Doug Marcaida, you can see where I'm going with it here. It's almost like the continuation of that lineage. Bill Bagwell, whose Bagwell buoys I own, mentioned Jerry Fisk, who would be the carrier of the buoy legacy, made Ricardo Vilar his protege. And so fundamentally what I'm holding here in this Filipino Itak sword designed by Doug Marcaida, you can see how that legacy is, starting with Bill, then through Jerry, then through Ricardo and Doug. Although, frankly, it goes several hundreds, maybe even thousands of years back to the Filipino warriors who created and relied upon this very sacred tool. Some things that really stand out for me about this sword: it is absolutely flawless in its execution. 10, 80, 15, and 20, 275 layers of Damascus steel. You can see the ladder pattern on it. The way I see it, they're almost like ripples in the ocean. So there's a lot of things going on this blade. There's just a really good energy to it. But from a design and craftsmanship, really super spectacular. There is a very slight recurve here, which you see in the Itak design. The one thing that I like seeing here, and it's something that I really favor, is the fact that Kuya Doug requested that there be a sharpened back edge here. It changes a lot of the dynamics of the sword in terms of it being more of a slicer and a cutter rather than a traditional Itak, which tends to be more of a chopper, and a little bit more on that later. But you can see that it's flexible, it can bend, you can put enough bend to it that it's something that actually comes back to true. The structural weakness of any knife, any sword, is actually going to be lateral stress. And the longer a blade happens to be, there's going to be more leverage against it if there's any lateral stressors, meaning stressors coming this way and this way. If you happen to take your sword and rather than going ahead with the edge but somehow hitting it this way, the lateral stressors are actually going to hold up. The other part that I really like is the full tang construction. So that means that 10, 80, 15, and 20, 275 layers of steel goes all the way from the tip of the sword all the way to the bottom of that sword. It is a full tang construction, and I love that. It's phenomenal. However, what I really like about it is the fact that most full tang construction swords and knives tend to be very heavy, but this is actually a little bit on the lighter side, really lively side. In fact, the balance point of the sword is a little further forward of the handle. The other thing that makes it lighter is the fact that there is a fuller here. There's a little bit of fuller, if you can see it. So some of the steel had been removed so that it's a little lighter. But also, because it's a sharpened edge on this side, that means a little less steel, which means it can move in a much more lively fashion. I like that the blade itself has this very natural guard here. So this is not sharp at all. So you can kind of choke up on it and feel really comfortable that your hand is not going to slip forward. This is the first Itak sword I have ever handled that has this degree of flex in the steel and to return to true. Really fantastic. The second thing I want to point out is something I pointed out in the unboxing video: the intentional weight distribution of the sword. This one is pretty important. What I was talking about is if my sword hand is neutral this way, notice that the sword is already tilting forward at about 15 degrees. We can all see this. So you would expect, with my wrist being neutral, that if I let go of my finger, it's gonna fall forward. In fact, you will actually see it with this Itak Tagalog. It's already gonna fall forward. And you find this in most traditional Filipino weapons. Among traditional Filipino weapons, when you start to let go of that trigger finger and that thumb, it's going to start to fall forward and start to build that momentum. In fact, right about here, it falls all the way down, which makes it one hell of a chopper. What Kuya Doug and Ricardo has done is that by me letting go and it staying neutral, what they have done is have it so that it doesn't have a momentum of its own. It's something that will allow the practitioner to slice and cut, but more importantly, redirect. It is very hard for anybody who's ever handled a traditional Filipino sword. They tend to be a little on the heavy side. So once it falls, it's gonna fall in that direction. You have no choice. Once you let go of your fingers and it starts to go in that direction, or you start to move with the sword and it starts to go in that direction, it's going in that direction. What we are seeing in Kuya Doug's sword is the fact that if I let it go, it doesn't necessarily move. It moves maybe a little bit, maybe a touch. If I start to release with my middle finger and ring finger, then it starts to move slightly. What that means is that if I start to move with the blade, I can always redirect. This is a critical feature of it because it has a sharpened false edge. So if I start to cut and I see that there's another opportunity, I can redirect. And if I'm going to push cut forward, I can redirect. So what you're going to see me do in terms of the movement of the sword is that this is the kind of sword that will allow, because of the speed, because of the design of it, it's going to move very quickly, but it's going to redirect just as quickly. And that's what makes it very exciting, because moving and redirecting with the amazing Filipino Itak sword in that design and then being able to redirect it, frankly, is something that I've never had the opportunity to do. But I do have that opportunity to do it with this amazing Filipino Itak design that is a collaboration with Master Smith Ricardo Vilar and Kuya Doug Marcaida. I want to see how it moves, and I want to see what kind of insight it gives me in terms of my own personal practice. I have a movement prep protocol right before I start to move with any of the tools that I show on this episode. Now, whether that is a buoy, a tomahawk, or more recently a karambit, and even a balisong, there's some form of soft tissue preparation, some sort of loading facilitation. That way my neuromuscular system, my musculoskeletal system, and also my myofascial system is nice and super reactive. That way there are no accidents. This is why I work primarily with live blades and tools on my channel. So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you, just to raise to your awareness that moving with sharp objects, serious objects, like the Filipino Itak of Kuya Doug Marcaida and Ricardo Vilar, is a very serious business. So when you see me move with it, what you're going to see is how the entire body integrates with the sword. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for letting me share.
Sharp swords and knives are not toys, and they are not child's play. It is a very serious business, so it is important for us to prepare ourselves both from a musculoskeletal perspective and a neuromuscular perspective. So what I'm showing you is the movement prep that I like to do before I do any martial movement with the weapons that I like to show on my channel. These types of exercises that you're seeing ensure that my entire physiology is prepared to move with a sharp weapon. So you have percussive technologies, soft tissue hydration, movement facilitation, so that my proprioceptive and mechanoreceptive capabilities are at top notch to ensure that when I move with the sword, one, it is completely safe, I don't risk any injury, but most importantly, I can honor the tool and the art that absolutely expresses what it is meant to be. Being physically prepared for this sword also sets you up to ensure that you are worthy of moving with the sword. At first, you're going to see me move with it with a lanyard. This is in the tradition of cutting competitions to ensure that the sword is really secure in your hand, but I prefer to move with it with a greater degree of freedom, so I actually work with it without the lanyard. At first, what you're going to see me do is some of the traditional cincoteros, and the methodology that I like to use here is the very economic movements that you see in Calis Illustrissimo. So at first, what you see are some of these movements that are something that you find in Calis Illustrissimo. Then I start to move with the payong, which is a type of test on whether a sword is really well balanced so it doesn't load on the shoulder. And I'm finding that there are really great degrees of freedom with the sword. There's no problem with the shoulder when I move with it. Also, it's light enough so I can hand it off to the left hand. It's something that you see sometimes in Calis Illustrissimo and in the Dizon methodology, where they use a sword in that earth grip. And I really like working with it in this manner. But again, because of its neutral balance and because of how lively it is, I would recommend that if you're going to work with a sword that has these types of balance dynamics, I really prefer and recommend that you work with the Calis Illustrissimo methodology. Calis Illustrissimo requires that the practitioner remain relatively tall and straight, but also ensures that the core is activated, so a lot of the movements come from the core. So when you see me move with the sword here, it remains relatively light and free because a lot of those movements come from my hips. A lot of the slashing and the redirecting hang of it comes from these very subtle dynamics that come from the core. You'll also see me start to use some power assists where you see me take my left hand and tap my arm. When I tap my arm in that manner, it allows me to push on my right hand, and when that right hand shoots in front of the target, the movement of the sword is such that it is much faster and that much more deadly. But there are some redirecting capabilities of the sword as well. So you'll see me as I'm moving here, every now and then I'm going to take a shot and shoot it out with that sharpened swedge. And when you see that sharpened swedge, it actually changes the beat structure of the sword so that you have this typical 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rhythm, but every now and then that beat structure is going to change because that swedge is going to go ahead and change it. When I start to play with close quarters and some fulcrum striking, notice that the sword can actually hug right across the entire body, my body, and it conforms to it so that when I move from the core and I take my left shoulder to come forward, it becomes one with me so that when I slice across the target, it's completely supported by the movement and momentum of my entire torso. Really fantastic. Also, something that you notice is that it is relatively easy for me to stay straight and tall when I'm moving with it because of that neutral balance. Now I'm going to move into this mass attack type of context where I am moving and attacking all types of opponents, pretending that I'm surrounded. And now I want to see how the sword moves. And you'll see that some of the targeting now changes. So sometimes it's on the high line, sometimes it's on the low line, sometimes it cuts all the way up on the high line, but sometimes it's going to go behind me. Because when you see it go behind me, it's because I am mimicking as if I am surrounded by several opponents. It moves really well in that fashion, and I will say that the sword, because of its neutral balance, never really ran away with me. I always felt really sure-footed with it. I never felt any fatigue in my hand or in my wrist, because sometimes when you have a sword that's a little on the heavier side, a little bit on the chopper, and then you have to redirect the targeting, not only in terms of your arm having to move the sword, but also your footwork having to accommodate for it, sometimes what you're going to feel is that your sword is actually going to pull your body forward. But as you can see, in that entire time I was moving with it, my torso stayed relatively stable, nice and tall. And a big part of that is because of the neutral balance that was created by Ricardo when he made this sword. When I move around with it also, you see that as I do all of these kind of severe changes in angles of striking, at no point do you see me even begin to lose my balance. It's almost as if I'm moving with a sword that's really super light, really super dynamic, that doesn't cause me too much stress when it comes to moving with it. This is a really sharp sword, so there should naturally be some stress with it, but when I'm moving with it, it is an absolute pleasure. I'm also going to move with it now, just as a point of illustration, with the Syok Winkler Tomahawk. And again, just as a point of illustration, that the Syok Winkler is really forward heavy, so you can actually feel it kind of pull you along a little bit. I think it's designed with that type of intentionality behind it. But because of the neutral balance of the sword created by Ricardo, you don't necessarily see me disturb my balance or equilibrium, even though the Syok Winkler could possibly do that. So this is something I've never done before. This is my first time actually doing it. But because of the well-crafted construction of these two tools, it's actually quite a pleasure for me to discover how well they move together. And I really hope that this is something that you're seeing and enjoying and finding educative for yourself, because when tools are really well constructed, when there's a lot of thought put into those types of designs, now you have a sword that's also going to be a pleasure to work with, but also you'll find that you're going to discover a lot of things. It's easy to stay neutral. You don't necessarily have to disrupt your body biomechanics, pretending to lose your balance just to try to catch up with the sword. I really hope you enjoyed this video, because this sword is a real pleasure to work with. Stick around, stay tuned, more videos to come.